Hi, I'm Rana Begum. I'm a visual artist and I live and work in London. My work is about light, colour and form. I use a lot of different materials in my work and it really varies from scale, from small to large scale works.
Great. Welcome everybody. It's lovely to see you all here at the National Gallery. My name is Impressionists. I'm the Associate Curator for the Modern and Contemporary programme here. And it's a real delight to be able to invite you here to hear our discussion, a conversation, in front of this incredible painting by J.M.W. Turner of Ulysses deriding Polyphemus. It's a story from Homer's epic of the Odyssey. We'll talk a bit more about the significance of this painting in Turner's career during this talk, but I'm even more thrilled that we can invite the artist Rana Begum to be able to explore this painting together. As you may know, for those of you who know this series very well, The Unexpected View is an opportunity for us to invite an artist into the gallery, an artist who's making work today, to choose a work from our collections and explore that work together through a conversation, to see how actually their own work might help us reflect on the themes, the ideas, the forms of the paintings in our collection, and perhaps vice versa as well. It's another way in to exploring these great masterpieces on our walls. And also a great way of exploring contemporary art today, to get a snapshot of how different artists are working. Before I should continue, I should thank Hiscox as the contemporary art partner for the National Gallery and for their support of this evening's talk. Rana Begum is an artist who lives and works in London. Her refined language of minimalist abstraction blurs the boundaries between sculpture, painting, and the spaces we inhabit. Light, I think, as a major theme, as we'll discuss, is fundamental to her process, drawing an emphasis on how it reflects on colour and on the temporal experience. Rana graduated from fine art from the Chelsea College of Art and later gained a master's in painting from the Slade. Her work has been presented internationally as part of numerous exhibitions, and far too many for me to mention now. Rana's is particularly prolific in I think your output and your projects. But you might most recently have seen her work at the Box in Plymouth, at the Pitzhanger Gallery in Ealing, for those in Sweden at the Rana Centre of Art there, and also this beautiful show at Tate St Ives a couple of years ago. At the moment you can see her work at St Albans Museum, where her exhibition Ordered Form yeah. closes on the 14th of April. And you might also be able to catch some of her public art installations, particularly for The Line, which is this great programme that spans Greenwich and Tower Hamlets, near Canary Wharf, and fantastic installation as part of the Line Commission. So I encourage you all to kind of seek those out. I've known and been following Rana's work for a long time now, as her inventive exploration of colour and light takes ever more numerous forms through her sculpture, printmaking and drawing practices. So I'm thrilled that we're able to hold this conversation this evening to explore her interest in Turner, the way that he explores light in this very radical way, and to be able to particularly have a close reading of this work together. After Turner's death, the eminent art critic John Ruskin declared that this painting to be the central picture of Turner's career. So we'll kind of work out why that is, and maybe you've got very different opinions to that, so we'll see. Yeah. So welcome, Rana. So to begin, yeah. why did we come to Turner as the choice for a painting to discuss this evening?
I think when I was looking through the collection the National Gallery connection. I was drawn to Turner's work mainly because of his connection with light. I felt like he was one of the artists that really explored light in a way that I kind of look at or think about and use in my work. And so I think when I first spoke about
the fighting temporal,
I was really excited and actually couldn't believe that as a student, I missed Turner completely. I mean, I was looking at Monet and Cézanne and how they were exploring light in their work. So it was a wonderful discovery through our conversation that finding out how much Turner used light in his work and how much he experimented with pigment and color. So,
I mean, that's especially interesting for us to kind of draw that interest into this painting. As I mentioned, Ruskin thought this was a very important painting in Turner's career. I think many other Turner experts now would kind of contend that view, but it still marks an important moment, a transition between what we consider early Turner and late Turner.
Yeah, but what was really exciting about his journey was how much he was pushing himself. I mean, I find that I'm constantly doing that in the studio, and there is some time I think, does it make sense? Does it connect? Can people actually understand what I'm doing? And actually, I remember, I think it was in 2016 when I had my solo show at Parasol Unit. I had so many doubts. I didn't know whether I could do a solo show in an institute like that, but also, second was, does it make sense? Can people actually connect that journey? And so that was really exciting to kind of discover how much Turner was kind of pushing his work, pushing kind of the limits of some of the materials that he was working with, and pushing to kind of capture light as almost a three-dimensional kind of object. And that was, it's something that I really struggle on a two-dimensional kind of plane, if you like. I think painting, and I think this is why like my work kind of jumps around a lot in terms of it's constantly trying to kind of come out of the wall. But what was really exciting was how actually this kind of movement that you see in Turner's painting or brushstrokes is achievable. And this change is achievable on this kind of two-dimensional level. And I found that really exciting.
I think exactly that with that tussle and that trying to wrestle with this idea of how to capture that experience, that sensory experience of light, is something that Turner was really occupied with throughout his career. I think, early on when we see the classical scenes that Turner was painting, you'll see some of them in the Barry rooms just around the corner. He's thinking about light and light's effect on the architecture of that spaces. Some of them kind of fantastical, some of them based on kind of real buildings that he saw.
Well, he was really inspired by Claude, who and light and architecture, and that was something that I remember as a student being really inspired by. I remember actually, being in the cathedral in St Albans and drawing and trying to kind of capture the architecture and light, and so that was, I think it's really fascinating that he was kind of pushing those boundaries. So he's not, and I think this is why for me this painting is also particularly kind of important, because this is where he's moving away. You can see the shift that's happening from realism to something more abstract, something that's much more about sensory and about movement, about light, and that's why it's really exciting, and I'm really excited to be kind of talking about it.
I think what sort of occupies us when we first look at the painting is that it's a grand narrative scene. You know, it shows that story of Ulysses, you know, escaping from the grips of Polyphemus. Ulysses and his men are captured on the island, and they overcome Polyphemus by blinding him during the night. So you see the kind of giant figure of Polyphemus up in this corner, and they escape at dawn. You know, so it's this great sort of triumphant sort of narrative.
But I think that's it's really important also to point out, because at that time there was a trend isn't the right word, but there was a kind of emerging of really creating paintings that were quite mythical and really lifted the spirit, and also celebrating kind of a certain moment in British kind of history, if you like, where Britain is almost kind of trying to kind of compare itself to, you know, Rome and
other grand powers.
So
absolutely. And you know, very much taking on that theme, you know, this grand mythological story. But
is he actually interested in that? This is what was kind of I was kind of thinking, is he actually interested in the narrative, or is he using the narrative as a tool to kind of explore light? You know, it's giving him an opportunity to kind of really, you know, explore some of the ways of light plays, or even in, you know, what's happening down here in the painting. I forgot what's...
these sea nymphs.
And like that transparency and the layers that are involved. I found, I don't know, I mean, I've never been interested in the Greek kind of mythology. And looking at his work, I sometimes wonder, when he is working with the subject matter or the theme, is it really about that, or is he so kind of, you know, involved in the painting and the action of the painting?
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like the narrative is a sort of vehicle, the visual narrative is a vehicle to experiment with other things. You know, when we look closely...
That's my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something really interesting when you're looking at these sort of mythological forms. So, you know, Rana, you pointed out the sea nymphs and just at the prow of this ship. And then also very closely, and you probably won't be able to see this from afar, but the way that he's shown the rays coming out of the sun, you'll actually see a sort of cavalry of horses representing Apollo as the sun, and his chariot kind of raising the sun out of the sky. So suddenly he's sort of creating this allegorical form to that physical sense of light. The sea nymphs, you know, there's this idea of phosphorence, you know, there's this idea of a light emitting from not necessarily a combustible source, but emitting from something else, being captured or reflected in some way, being represented by these nymphs.
Yeah, I mean, he's thinking about so many things. There's so many layers in this painting, you know. I mean, when you initially kind of see the painting, you're moved by the, you know, the whole experience of the narrative, but you know, as you get closer, you start kind of unraveling, and you recognize there's just layers and layers of it, you know, and even in terms of what's going on in, you know, in the kind of the hills or the mountains. It's really interesting. And even here, you know, I was kind of thinking, like, in terms of kind of the way he's showing light in the caves, and I mean, it's just, it's really fascinating seeing how he's kind of trying to kind of imitate light in its many forms, and it's incredible, and it's in this one painting he's able to do that, and I can't achieve that in my work. I can't, you know, even though I use light almost like a tool in my work, I find that I have to constantly kind of strip back, constantly kind of remove, to really grasp that kind of ephemeral quality of light, that kind of translucent, and it's really difficult. And even with like the piece on the line, the cloud, as part of the line project, seeing that in different, I mean, when we installed it when it was hailing, snowing, raining, and like crazy wind. We were so scared being up on the scaffolding.
Almost like one of Turner's other seascapes, rocky
Looking
seascapes.
back now, it does feel like I was up there in the mast with Turner. But it was, it's incredible to actually feel that.
Can we just describe the form of the cloud? Because I think that's a really interesting, it was a really interesting development in your practice, but the materials that you use and how you put them together, the combinations of different colours. Can you just explain what the cloud is?
That's a series of work where it's made up of wire mesh that's been powder coated various colours and cut into kind of different rectangular shapes and then hand formed into these kind of cloud-like shapes. And there's always a colour inside. And so you get this kind of layering effect happening, but you also have light kind of filtering through. So there's, as you walk around, the way the shape is kind of molded, you end up really seeing a movement, basically.
And this is also suspended, right?
This particular work is suspended, but most of the time, that series is quite physical, and you can kind of relate, because it's public art, it had to be high up so that people can't touch. But normally when I show them in galleries and museums, they're kind of quite close and quite low down so that you can physically be part of, your body is quite connected to that work. I
think there's something interesting about drawing a connection with Turner there as well, because of that idea of trying to capture an experience of light. I think this is kind of what marks, I think, this difference between early Turner and late Turner. Late Turner is where we think are the most radical of his paintings, where he's really trying to capture the experience of that sense of light or of the water, the atmosphere of a space. And I think you do
he
this
is a radical in terms of the way he's kind of pushed.
And I think you'd also achieve this as well. The way that actually the sculptures capture this idea of the daylights, this changing light that we kind of live through, both as you move, but also throughout the time of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I spent. So when I started off, I think it was during my foundation course that I got introduced to kind of minimalist artists, and so. When I remember my tutor kind of saying, "Come with me," and he took me to the library and opened up these books, and it was people like Judd, Sol LeWitt, Agnes Martin, Frank Stella, and I remember thinking, "Oh my God, this is what I'm about." And at the time, I was doing kind of figurative work, but not at all kind of feeling excited or, and feeling actually really frustrated. But there was something that he saw in what I was making that it kind of, encouraged him to kind of show me these artists. And when I came back and I made a long list of things, it immediately, things like light, color, form, symmetry, repetition, immediately my work became abstract. So I spent, I think, 4 or 5 years just exploring light and form and trying to understand how light affects the work, and in the most kind of subtlest way. And I completely kind of withdrew from color, and I knew that I didn't want to have too many things to kind of, color required its own time and moment of exploration. So it's kind of, I find myself kind of going back a lot. So when I was looking at Turner, it made me think about that time, made me think about how I was looking at light, how I was exploring, and also, my partner kind of forced me to watch the Mike Leigh movie, which is about Turner, and I actually absolutely loved it. I mean, I loved how Mike Leigh was able to kind of really, really be involved in the way Turner experienced light and the environment around him. And that's something that keeps coming up for me, like whether I'm traveling or looking back in, some of my memories, it's that experience of light.
And that really connects with this work as well, in the sense that, so Turner produced this after returning from a trip to Italy, where he was exploring the country, and the influence of light that he experienced there really radically changed, I think, his understanding of painting light. After he returned from Italy, he based this on a sketch that he made while he was there, and you can see that actually, compared to the light that we see in his previous works, his works that he might have made on travels around England, this seems very kind of radical, the scene even, some people have said this is similar to the coast around Naples, but then you said that it's quite similar to the coast of Dorset,
Actually, I was in Dorset last year, and I remember, is it called the Durdle? And I remember sitting there with the kids and, trying to sketch, and there are moments in the day that light was just incredible, and I was trying to kind of capture the way, that was kind of the way the light was kind of falling onto the surface. And I think I only had my sketchbook and biros, and I was like, how am I supposed to do this? So it's incredible seeing, this, and seeing how he's kind of capturing the texture and the surface of the form of that kind of structure is.
I mean, it's really beautiful here how the form of that sort of those rocks sort of then blend seamlessly into the light, into the sky. There's something that he's really captured there. I wanted to talk a bit about the idea of traveling and spending time in another space. This is something that I think you've done within your practice, but also how these experiences of residing in a different place. You did a residency in St. Ives, in other places around the world. I wondered if you could talk about those experiences and how that sort of shaped your understanding of the way that you might use light or think about form, material.
I think I didn't realize kind of how sensitive I was to kind of the different places that I go to. And I think it all came up during my therapy, when I was talking about my childhood growing up in Bangladesh. And I think when I was kind of having that discussion, I thought I had a pretty incredible childhood in the countryside, surrounded by rice field and water. But there were moments I remember, being told off by my mum, sitting there and just contemplating and staring into space. And most of the time, I remember those particular moments. They were kind of, one location was kind of where you could see kind of endless kind of rice field. And just intense green. And the other was kind of the men's bathing pool. And it was quite big and wide, and I used to just love staring and seeing the kind of the ripple effect and the light on it. And in that moment, it made me connect to so many other moments that I traveled to, and it felt like I'd kind of, I felt a connection. I felt a sense of like, okay, I can't believe that I didn't, recognize these moments as kind of informative in terms of my work and where it kind of comes from. I remember going to Spain, traveling around Spain and going into the mosque in Cordoba, the mosque and cathedral. And I just, it gives me kind of goosebumps thinking about it, walking in and just feeling the light in the space, feeling the structure kind of respond to the light. Or even in Bangladesh, when I went back, and there's an architect that I've collaborated with called Marina Tabassum, and she's built this mosque in Dhaka, and she's another person that uses light as a material almost, and just feeling light and being able to experience light in that way. So now I feel I'm really conscious when I'm traveling. I always like to have my phone with me, as much as my family hate it. I do a lot of time lapse. I did a lot of time lapse in St. Ives. Just trying to capture that kind of.
So this is when you were a resident in Porthmeor Studios in St. Ives, where many artists have held residency there. I think that experience seemed like it was really informative in the way that you were thinking about not only the light in that extraordinary part of the country, but also the forms that were around, the materials of the space as well. Before we just talk about that, could you also touch on the collaboration with the architect and what you produced in that collaboration? Because there's something I think connected with this idea of light entering a space and how it reflects onto certain forms.
So that was actually for a group show at the Whitechapel Gallery, which is called This Is Tomorrow. And an artist, an architect is selected to kind of collaborate. And in that collaboration, I think it's kind of replicating a show that they had, I think, in the 60s. And it's where, you're kind of really responding to, I guess, the current time or, and thinking about the future. And so Marina and I obviously spoke a lot about Trump and American politics, because it was kind of seeping into the UK, especially after Brexit. And we really wanted to create a space that brought people together and created a calm, contemplative space. And I think light naturally, when you work with light in that way, and you can kind of channel light in a way into a space that really heightens your senses, I think it can have an incredibly positive impact on people. And so this space was created, and I think you can see it in the book, an image of it for the show. And I'm not very articulate in terms of I think the structure had a how would you say?
A light well.
Light well. And I worked on that light well to kind of highlight the light, if you like.
But using sort of multiple colours.
Yeah. Where, the angulation kind of picks up the light and kind of bounces the light around. So,
And then in St. Ives, you were able to kind of explore the way that light almost kind of worked with different forms and different materials, how materials helped colours kind of affect each other as well.
I mean, I went to St. Ives during that residency was to mainly look at light and colour and that relationship. But I found myself really taking colour away completely. And this was through, through working with the materials that I found there. So I had my studio overlooking, and you've got the sea, and then below my studio were two fishermen's studios. And of course, as a child, I grew up fishing, and I love the structures, the fishing net structures in Bangladesh. And and I love that material. So I kept going down saying, you know, can I work with some material? Can you let me borrow? And they were just not interested at all. And then one of the guy was like, "Oh, go next door, you know, he might let you have some stuff." And I went, and I was given this net, and the net also had some floats attached. Yeah. And I remember taking the floats apart and the net, you know, kind of really separating those two materials. And as I was kind of laying the floats on the floor, the light coming in through the window hit those floats. And I've known about Barbara Hepworth's work for a long time, you know, as the school that I went to had quite a few Barbara Hepworth's work, so, but never really felt a connection until that moment, that exact moment when the light hit. And I was like, I get it. Yeah. You know, I get, you know, what the curves are about. I get what the material, you know, why she was working with plaster or stone. And it was that sensitivity that made me look at those forms in a different way. And I completely removed colour and made work or replicated these floats in plaster and then in marble. But yeah, I mean, I was just really fascinated by the way, you know, Barbara Hepworth kind of used curves to really look at light. In the same way, I mean, Turner was looking at architecture and then landscape and then, you know...
But so also the sea, you know, the way that the sea
reflective
and that changing water really affects the light, you know. Yeah. There's something really quite powerful about that.
Yeah, and it's that change. So I mean, because of my, you know, difficulty, or I would say, or lack of attention span, if you like, I am literally my kids. I needed my work to embody change, and you know, and I knew that I didn't want to make kinetic work. That's not me. That's not what I was interested. But I wanted change in my work, and I thought, well, how could the works that I make embody change? And light was the only way that it could allow that change to happen, that it could allow someone to walk past one day and then another day, you know, suddenly make them stop because of the way it's kind of, you know, responding to the afternoon light. And that's what I find kind of really exciting.
I think that excitement also takes us back to Turner in a sense that even though he's capturing a light and fixing it in some sense, I think every time I come back to looking at one of his paintings, every time I come back to look at Ulysses deriding Polyphemus in this painting, it changes. I notice new things, but also the way that the light changes across painting.
Yeah, well, this is what is really exciting about this painting, is the way he's capturing that intense change, you know, going from dark, you know, kind of fiery cave to something that is much more natural and wide and expansive, you know. I just find it really fascinating. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's incredible to capture that on two-dimensional. Yeah. You know, when I look at like Judd, you know, someone, you know, a lot of people kind of describe Judd's work as kind of being soulless, but I don't think it's soulless at all. I think it's the complete opposite. You know, the experience I have with his work is just so moving. You know, the way light kind of responds to the material that he uses and the form is so exhilarating and exciting. Yeah.
And I would agree, and I think Turner also sort of was edging towards that, very much experimenting with the limits of what paint can do to capture that experience.
Yeah, it's just incredible. I mean, I find myself constantly kind of wanting to look at the painting, which is unusual for me.
Yeah, brilliant.
So, yeah.
Well, on that note, can you please join me in thanking Rana for all of your insights and for sharing your work with us today?
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.